Thank you to the Florida Citizens Alliance for inviting me to present my thoughts on what has been a whirlwind year in terms of education. My name is Kerry McDonald. I'm a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, a frequent Forbes contributor, and the author most recently of the book Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that was first published in the spring of 2019, but not surprisingly gained renewed interest in the spring of 2020 as approximately 50 million US K-12 students suddenly found themselves displaced from classroom learning in the wake of the school shutdowns. This time last year, worldwide, there were over 1 billion students who, again, were similarly displaced from their typical classroom learning. And it was a challenging time for everyone, but I started to see a few glimpses and glimmers of what would become a year that was marked by increased parental empowerment and by a pursuit of education alternatives. In April of last year, EdChoice did one of the first surveys of parents asking about their reactions to the school shutdowns and their kind of experiences with school closures. And they found that a month into it, more than half of the respondents, half of the parents, had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did before the pandemic. And I remember thinking at the time, gosh, if you think that this kind of emergency pandemic homeschooling that in many cases was still tied to a district school or to a private school, if you think this is a good experience and you have a favorable view of homeschooling as a result, just imagine the real thing when you can, as a typical homeschooler, be fully immersed in your community and in the people, places, and things around you. And of course, all of us were separated from our communities last spring, homeschoolers included. So it was challenging for everyone. And yet still, this was a glimpse of what was to come as parents really, I think for the first time, got a close-up look at what their children were learning or were not learning in these schools as a result of Zoom schooling and really seeing the classroom experience up close. And many parents began to say, gee, I've always been intrigued about homeschooling, or I've thought about different education experiences for my children, but I lacked that catalyst to make it happen. And the pandemic response really, I think, was the trigger that enabled them to make some choices and to select some different learning models. And that's what we started to see. Gallup came out with a poll in August of last year, finding that, suggesting that 10% of students in the US would be homeschooled. That would have been a doubling from Gallup's previous year poll, showing 5% of homeschoolers. And 2 months later, Education Week came out with a similar poll, finding 9% homeschoolers for this academic year. And both of those polls would suggest that the rate of independent homeschooling would have more than doubled since the start of the pandemic response last spring. So prior to the pandemic response, pre-pandemic, the US had just under 2 million homeschoolers, K-12, and now it's close to 5 million. So a more than doubling of independent homeschoolers, of families pulling their children out of a district school or out of a private school and choosing to direct their education themselves. And I think a lot of this was really because parents were dissatisfied with Zoom school, with reopening plans that they didn't agree with. Maybe they were not happy with hybrid models, or they were frustrated that schools weren't reopening for full-time in-person learning, or maybe they didn't like the idea of their kids having to wear masks all day and be socially distanced. So there were a whole variety of reasons why parents, I think, started to look for alternatives to their district school. We saw an increase in private school enrollment in many cases of parents flocking to private education because they realized that in many cases, private schools were more likely to reopen for full-time in-person learning than district schools that were often caught up with teachers' union demands around reopening that halted a lot of those plans. So what we also found in the fall, data showing that as more families flocked to independent homeschooling and to private education, not surprisingly, public school enrollment dropped precipitously in most US states. Back in December, the Associated Press and Chalkbeat released data from their surveys of 33 states for which they had data, although they suggested that this was probably the case in nearly all states, but certainly in the 33 that they collected data from, they found, again, a precipitous drop in public school enrollment this academic year that was due specifically to the pandemic response and school closures or school reopening plans, not to sort of demographic changes. And I think along with this came a real sense for parents that they were back in the driver's seat of their children's education, that they felt, again, more empowered to take a closer look at what their kids were learning. They began to really search for alternatives. They became more interested in models such as homeschooling or higher quality online learning, often through private low-cost providers that were much better quality, much more engaging and effective than the district's Zoom schooling, or they investigated other local private school options. And I think that that's going to continue into 2021 and perhaps beyond, particularly as in many cases, teachers unions continue to be slow to allow schools to reopen in many areas. You see that even in areas, especially in large urban areas where schools may be reopening, it's still sort of hybrid models with kids only attending in person a couple of days a week. In many cases, older students not attending in person at all. So there's still quite a bit of uncertainty for this coming fall. And I think that this will continue to urge parents to take matters into their own hands to make sure their children are getting the highest quality education experience that they can get. And along with this, we are seeing increasing support for school choice policies. So Real Clear Opinion Research last fall released survey data finding a 10% increase in support for school choice policies, such as education savings accounts, tax credit scholarship programs, and vouchers, compared to the spring. So up to 77% of respondents in this particular survey saying that they have a more favorable view of school choice policies, that they would support school choice policies. Other survey data suggesting the same thing. And currently, more than 24 US states have active legislation to propose or expand school choice policies. And this is a great sign. I think a lot of parents who may never again have really thought much about school choice, maybe never thought it really applied to them, again, are much more supportive of programs that enable funding to follow students instead of funding systems or schools that in many cases are not fully reopened. So that's another positive sign that I think is going to continue to stay with us even post-pandemic. I'll also say another bright spot to what was otherwise a difficult year has been the growth in education entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs realizing parents' demand for education alternatives, their demand for high quality private online learning resources, or pandemic pods and microschool networks that have emerged. And I think that this may unleash really a new age of new innovative, enterprising education models that will be great for parents and students and educators alike. So as much as it's been a disruptive year and difficult for many families, I think that the fact that parents are now back in charge of their children's education, that there's more support for school choice policies, and that there's a renewed sense of education entrepreneurship and innovation in learning models, I think that those are some bright spots that can keep us going as we remain these final days of this pandemic response. Thank you so much for having me.